As part of our planning process, we want to really give some time to the concept of a Yurbi app. It's something you may not be familiar with, so we're going to show you in this video what it is, and we're going to talk about all the benefits and sort of the decisions that you have to make as you build the Yurbi app. The Yurbi app is pretty critical in Yurbi because it is the center of everything. It's the hub of all the querying from your database, of the security. So you want to make sure you get it right, and it's not a horrible thing if you have to redesign your architect or your Yurbi app, but for time purposes, you do want to do it as close to ideal as possible from the beginning. So what we're going to cover today is we're going to talk about what the goal of the architect role is within Yurbi. We're going to give you an overview of what a Yurbi app looks like, and then we're going to talk about that process that you should start to plan now on how you're going to get started. It's the very once you connect to your data, it's the very first thing you do. So this is something that you're looking at doing really soon as you start to roll out Yurbi. Now, the primary goal of the architect role in Yurbi is really just to create and maintain these things that we call Yurbi apps. So let's actually take a look at a Yurbi app so you understand what we're referring to. Okay, so I'm logged into Yurbi. I'm the admin, and we have a specific role called the architect. So that's what when we mention the architect, we're talking about this particular tab. Only that role will have access to that tab. I'm going to go ahead and click on that, and you'll see that the very first thing they could do is select an app and a report type. And you'll see that I've got a listings of apps here. Now, these apps are directly related to what we did in an earlier stage, which was connect to our app databases. So for every database you connect to, or every you can connect to database multiple times. We'll talk about that here. But for every database you connect to, you'll have an app in the architect. Now, the only exceptions to that is if it's a premium app. You'll see Yurbi v10 is listed here is one of our premium apps. The apps that you have in the architect are what we call the AnyDB or build your own apps. So that would be any of your Microsoft Excel or CSV imports, as well as any of your just database connections. You won't see your premium apps listed in the architect. Now, when you select an app, you'll see that it's going to give you a screen here where you have a listing of report types. When I click on a report type, you'll see the other panels fill in. There's a concept of a report tree, and there's the concept of a database view. Now, the database view is the primary thing that the architect is going to do. They're going to connect all of their tables from a particular database into a report type. And then once they tell Yurbi how these database tables are joined and connected, we'll show you that in another video. Then you'll start to take the individual fields out of these database tables and put them in this report tree. And then this report tree eventually becomes what your builders will use in order to build reports. So you'll see the report types. They click on a report type and they get the report tree, and then they can start building reports. So you can kind of see that the architect is a starting point because that's how you're going to, one, tell Yurbi how your tables are related, and two, tell Yurbi what fields you want to be exposed to your users in order to build. So this is a very high level overview. We'll get into all the specifics of how you do things later, but this is a planning video. So we're going to go back and now talk about why all the different elements of this Yurbi app are important and the key things that you need to plan for. Okay, so let's recap. What is a Yurbi app? Well, it's a semantic layer. It sits on top of your raw data and it translates that into user-friendly information. Now I didn't go over it in that overview, but you can actually have the raw database fields as well as some virtual fields or calculated fields. We'll talk about that. And that actually adds to the power of the Yurbi app is that you can make the builder's life easier the more things that you put into that report tree. So that's sort of the concept with the architect is your role is to translate that database into the things that your business users are going to need to build the reports that they have. Um, some things that you do is organizing that data into those things we call report types. Those should be logical groupings of similar types of fields, and it should match up to the use cases that your users kind of are looking for. So if you're connected to a help desk system and you follow an ITIL methodology, you'll probably have a report type for incidents, and one for requests, and one for change orders, and one for assets. If you're doing some sort of financial system, you'll probably have one for customers and invoices and accounts receivable, accounts payable, and things like that. So just logical groupings of data. And then that report tree should be labels and terms and folders that the business users understand, not, of course, the cryptic field names that are in the database itself. The key thing about the Yurbi app is you want to put them in the context of who your builder is going to be. So if you have a technical team and you have maybe just the Yurbi administrator who's going to be building reports, and the Yurbi app doesn't have to be super complicated or well thought out. You can just, for that person who understands the database extremely well and knows SQL and is very familiar with the database, you could just put everything into one report type and call it a day. But if you do plan to open up the report builder to customers or department leads or non-technical users, then you really want to spend the time to think about, um, you know, what how those users relate to that data in the database, and make it something that they can understand. Now, I mentioned that you can the Yurbi apps you see in the architect are tied to the app registrations. There are use cases where you might create two Yurbi apps off the same database. And that's when you do want to have that personal approach. For example, let's say you're connecting to a help desk system, and you're going to give one building Yurbi app to your help desk manager. It's going to have everything coming out of that system. They get access to a lot of fields. Then you're going to give another Yurbi app maybe to a department level, a field services organization. They don't have to build against everything in the database. They really just need to build against the core fields. What you have with the Yurbi app is what we call column level security. You control which fields that individual person can see and can build from. So if there's something in the database that you don't want one particular group of people to see and have access to build reports on, but you do want another segment of users to have that, then that's where you would give them each individual Yurbi apps. And that's where we come up with the concept that Yurbi apps are personal. That's where your column level security ties in. Now, we sort of hit this in the last planning video, but there's three types of Yurbi apps. There's your premium apps. There's the NEDB. Those are the ones that we talked about showing up in the architect. That's where you build your own. You connect to your own data sources. The premium apps were pre-built by us, and we don't talk about those as much these days, but we do have out-of-the-box integrations with CA Service Desk, Ivanti Service Desk, HP ServiceNow, tools like that. And then the other type of Yurbi app, however, is if you're importing Excel or CSV data. We're going to take that Excel data and convert it into database format and store it in the Yurbi backend database, and we'll automatically build you a Yurbi app that you can go in and then fine tune and modify in the architect. Now, as we covered in that overview, there's three processes to that Yurbi app. There's your report types, that's the logical grouping of the database fields. There's a report tree, that's going to be the list of fields that you share with the builder. And then there's the database view, and that's going to be all the tables and the joins and the relationships on how all those fields are connected. The database view is what allows Yurbi to dynamically build that SQL query in order to pull data from your database without the business user or the builder having to write any code or know anything about your schema. So it's important to kind of understand that the process of the architect is to one, build those report types, bring in the tables related to those report types and the views, build the relationships between those tables, and then expose the fields in the report tree that the builder should have access to. Now, a couple things that if you're starting to think about who in your organization would be responsible for this task, well, they need some technical skills, of course. They've got to understand your database schema. They've got to know what tables and views and joins are present in the queries that you're trying to run. If you do have existing SQL queries, if you have an existing reporting product and you've been writing SQL code, all that information is stored right there in the where clauses and the join clauses are all in your SQL query. So that really makes it helpful to build out your Yurbi app. And then if you have a database, if a vendor gives database documentation, what's called a schema or entity relationship diagram, then that also helps it out quite a bit. But you do need to understand the database. You probably have to have a good understanding of SQL functions because as we build in those calculated fields and data transformations, or if you need some SQL views, you'll want to be able to have the knowledge and permission to do those. And if you as an organization don't have these skills in house and you have a database that's not well documented, guess what? We've been doing this stuff now for over 20 years, so we have a team of experts that can, via our professional services organization, help you build that Yurbi app out and kind of figure out your database. What's nice is because our process is what's called an application layer schema, is even if your database is not ideal, the joins are kind of cryptic, or the data stored in the database is not what your users see in the application, we can do a lot of things to kind of build that application logic right inside the Yurbi app. And we're not talking about developing custom code. It's just the process of using those SQL functions to transform data into the appropriate information. Now, there's one more skill needed that's not technical, and that's going to be on the business side. You've got to kind of understand what your business users are looking for, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Now, there's a lot of benefits to this process compared to just writing SQL code. I mean, in some cases, if you're a technical user, it could be much easier to just write a SQL query and spit out a data set and do something with it. But the key with Yurbi is once you build this Yurbi app, it's a reusable object. It's repeatable. You don't just have one SQL query that you can get one specific output for. You've got a dynamic process now where users can pick any combination of fields, add any combination of criteria and formulas, and bring back any sort of data set that they need from that. So it's the permutations of report possibilities that become possible in the Yurbi model. And as I mentioned, we can correct things at the semantic layer that might be database issues. What I mean from that, maybe you have an old legacy database. It's typed as a character field in the database, but you're storing numeric values only in there, and you want to treat that data as numeric values. Maybe you have some date fields. We find databases, legacy databases, where the date fields are actually character text fields in the database. We can fix some of those things in the Yurbi app by applying things like cast or just applying functions to transform that data into the proper things. The next thing is very agile. You don't have to figure out the whole database at once. You can start with one report type and start with just a couple fields out of that report type for a set of key reports. And then as your users ask for more information, you can start to build out and add more things to that. And then the last thing is that field level security. We talked about column level security being what actual database fields you expose in your Yurbi app. But once you put that field in your Yurbi app, there's a aspect of data level security so that two different builders could use that same app and see totally different data because we can dynamically restrict them to just seeing their database or their tenant information or whatever the data level restriction might be. And all of that is handled dynamically by Yurbi once you have that that Yurbi app created. Now, there's a couple challenges I want to point out. One, if there is no database documentation, then of course you have to kind of figure it out, reverse engineer it. If you do have SQL queries, that makes it really a lot easier to do that. If the application logic is unknown, I mean, I'll give you an example. There's some tools out there like network monitoring tools, and they do some service level calculations and uptime calculations that are sometimes very cryptic, and that's part of their intellectual property. They don't want you to know how they calculate their uptime and things like that. So in the database, they just have the raw data, and then it's their application that does the calculation of what that means. Sometimes it could be hard to figure out those formulas. So that's part of the challenge if you do have that sort of database. That's very rare, but again, that's cases where our professional services team can help you. And then if you just have tons of tables, the whole drag and drop, click, and the method of building an app can be tedious if you have a tremendous amount of tables. But again, we have ways that can help you with that if you do that. Top three takeaways as we wrap this up is as you're building a Yurbi app, you want to put yourself in the shoes of the actual business user. So Definitely have your technical hat on to understand the database, but think about who's going to be using this as an end user and what are the names of the fields as they understand it and the relationship of the data as they understand it. You want to keep it very focused, so if you do have a lot of different personas, a lot of different people needing access, then create multiple Yurbi apps. Don't just try to fit them all into one. And the last takeaway is we're always here to help, so you can always reach out to us at our support.yurbi.com website. And I'll put that up as the end screen if you do need any help. And let's move on to the next video.